Oh, we can take a minute and look. You can't have Annabelle's copy if others don't have that same copy on the front.
Library.
Yeah, the,
Can I see that porcelain?
Just toss it over, give me a little more.
hey, good morning. Well, we're just starting.
You might have to.
Thank you.
Annabelle, could I use that for a second, please? Sure. Thank you.
Oh, that's the cover, I see, okay.
Yeah, the cover. I found it interesting to note, there's a note on the cover. Did you read it? Anybody?
Yeah.
Who designed it?
Oh, that, I didn't see that.
Where's this got? Designed it.
Yeah.
Cover designed by Kai, Texel, but is that,
That's your,
that's mine, that's not.
Yeah.
This one's fully illustrated, it's got all kinds of,
Oh, wow.
yeah, it's from the library.
Yeah, so is that.
So,
That's a library copy. You know, I had a hard time finding it. I finally had to ask. We went over to the teenage section. That's where it was. It was not on the regular section.
well, it's taught in high school, because my granddaughter, who was a junior last year, they were reading it.
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah,
that's where we finally found it. It was not on the regular fiction shelves.
Oh, I read the Red Badge of Courage before I read The Great Gatsby. School.
Oh, no.
It blows my mind now that I know that those are, especially Red Badge. That is a rough book.
Well, I was looking for the explanation of that. I thought it was in here,
Knitting.
but I don't.
Oh,
I left her a message.
Oh, here it is. Note on it.
I said, Mrs. Bowtie Senior. No,
got it.
you gotta go check it out.
Well, shoot.
does anybody else have this quote?
which was, can't read it from here.
Then wear the gold hat, that will move her.
Yeah.
If you can bounce high, bounce for her too, till she cry. Lover, gold hatted, high bouncing lover, I must have you. Does anybody else?
It should
Yeah,
be.
I got that.
You
Yeah,
have it also?
yeah.
Thomas Park in,
Yeah, okay.
Well, my tail fell off on this one. I can't find it. There was a description though of that cover, which was the original cover. Maybe it's on the back.
This
No,
Yeah,
That's the original.
that's the original design by, somebody was reading, an artist, a man who did a lot of work for film and other covers, but it tried to capture, captured, the tear and the green dot for the light across the sound across the bay
Yeah.
from
oh,
Gatsby. And then it's got all the amusement park, cityscape down below. And the eyes, the pupils of the eyes are supposed to be nude women in recline. If you could look
Oh, yeah.
closely on there, you can see it. I'm not sure why or how appropriate that was. But anyway, well, Tom had a good suggestion for the beginning, especially since we're starting. Tom, you want to make your comment about the narrative?
I can't read anymore, so I'm living in the past, but when I was reading critical materials over the years, the unreliable narrator would come up over and over again. And I never really got it. I'd like somebody to tell me how it refers obviously to that. Can somebody take that a little bit for me?
I can't hear him.
he's talking about unreliable narrators.
Yeah.
And actually, Fitzgerald takes this technique from Conrad, Joseph Conrad. The Heart of Darkness is similar, but there are, I'm trying to think of an example of a really unreliable narrator. think isn't really that unreliable. He's,
I agree.
he has his biases and he has his opinions and he expresses them.
Right.
But he doesn't change the story. Best example of unreliable narrator is, what?
I'm very fan.
You think Huckleberry Finn is not reliable?
A 13-year-old boy, of course not.
Well, okay, that brings up a point. For me, there's a distinction
Yeah.
between someone a narrator who may not know everything that's going on, or who may be naive, 12 or 13-year-old boy. And then for me, the unreliable narrator is one that you really can't trust at all. Like in Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado,
Right,
where the narrator is insane,
yes.
and he ends up walling out Fortunato out of jealous rage because Fortunato is a better wine aficionado than he is. He walls him up, and that's the end of the story. In Pace Requiescat is the last line. That's what comes to me when I hear somebody speak of an unreliable narrator, somebody that really is out to take advantage somehow. For instance, if Iago were telling the story of Othello, the arch villain, the ultimate liar and the manipulator of people's feelings. But so, Sam, I think your point is a good one, because in Huckleberry Finn, Twain takes advantage of Huck's 12-year-old naivete to get some things said in an innocent way that have greater depth than what Huck realizes. For instance, when the Duke and the King are carrying on about one thing and another, fabricating all these foolish things, and Huck says something like, I hated to see Jim, the runaway slave, bowing and scraping as though they really were royalty. And it made it resonate more with me. Another good one was when he goes to the church. Twain was no lover of doctrinary religion, as a lot of people were. They tried to throw out the whole thing for the bathwater. I disagree with Twain on that premise. But Huck wanders into the church to get the testament for the young girl who's going to elope with the other family that her family's feuding with. So it has to be secretive. So he says, so I went on to the church, but there weren't anything there but a hog or two had wandered in. And hogs likes a punching floor in summertime because it's cool. Then he says, I notice most folks don't go to church only when they have to, but a hog is different. And I couldn't, when I was trying to teach it to sophomores or seniors, it took a while for them to get the irony of it, that a church may not be fitting for anything but a hog, because of the doctrinary nature of it, and all the episodes in there where the widow Douglas and Miss Watson are regaling Huck with stories about how it's going to be so great to be in heaven, and all you do is float around all day and play on a harp and sing hymns and stuff like that. But it was, I don't think that was a bitter remark. Anyway, we're getting too far afield here, but I was drawing that distinction. Sam, do you see where I was going with that?
He's a naive narrator, but not a.
Well, if you remember, it's getting far off Gatsby, talking about Huck Finn. I'm not sure if Nick is a reliable narrator, because there are at least 3 times in the book, I underline them, you probably know what I'm talking about though, where he says, I am an honest man, or I am the only honest man, where he really has to hammer down the point that I know what's going on, I'm right. And yet the book ends with ultimately like the burden of truth being his. But does that in itself make him reliable narrator? And if we can go back to Huck Finn for a minute, Huck begins the book by saying his wife is talking, and Mr. Twain is sitting here with me, and he's typing as I'm talking. Or writing as I'm, you remember that?
He says, you don't know about this book without you have read another book called The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and mostly he told the truth.
Yeah.
There were some stretchers in there, but like I said, mostly he told the truth.
So what is the first line from Slaughterhouse 5? This is all true, more or less.
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, that to me isn't unreliable. That's, I mean, no fiction is 100% truth anyway. The best example of an unreliable narrator, I think, is Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Have you read that? Anyway, the narrator is the person who committed the murder.
Mhm.
And you don't know that until the very, very end.
Well, now you spoil it for us.
And it is my very favorite Agatha Christie.
Oh,
Because he is just totally, you're totally captivated by him, and that's unreliable narrative.
That may be a good reason. Most of those kinds of books I would not ever reread.
Right.
I read them and enjoy them, but then for me, and I'm glossing this because I don't know Agatha Christie, but a lot of the bestsellers and the whodunits and stuff they're not deep literature. I mean, they may be very good, like Treasure Island. It's a pleasure to read, but it doesn't have great depth, like
Right.
The Secret Share of Heart of Darkness or something like that, beautifully written. So ordinarily, I wouldn't reread it, but what you have said, Paul, right, is that it would be interesting if I read it, then now that I know,
Yeah.
I can read it with an informed opinion, sort of as a cheat sheet, but I can look and look for nuances in what the narrator is
Right.
saying at the same time that I happen to know the outcome. It would make it worth rereading. I think that would be kind of interesting. But the story within the story is not a new motif.
I don't think that Nick is right about everything. I don't think that makes him unreliable. I think you have to, with any narrator, you have to take it with a grain of salt and say, yeah, those are his biases, those are his prejudices. I understand that. I don't necessarily agree with them, but I understand what he's coming from his point of view. And that.
So his inconsistencies, I think, do not discredit him as reliable.
There's one incident in particular that made me think about his reliability. When he and Gatsby were parting ways for the last time, he yelled after Gatsby, "You're worth the whole lot of them together," or something. And immediately after he says that, he says, "I don't know why I said that. I didn't mean that. I've been very critical about him from this point."
Yeah, he says he represented everything
And that
unmitigated scorn.
Yeah. And yet he still likes Gatsby. There's something ineffable that draws him to
He's
Gatsby.
got a very low bar if he's worth the whole lot of them, and he's comparing him to Tom Buchanan and Daisy Buchanan, and what's the girl's name anyway? Jordan Baker. That's a pretty low bar. I mean, so yeah, he probably was worth a whole lot of them, but it's not saying that he's a great person,
Yeah, we didn't meet the only admirable people. Remember, I mentioned last time the old 100-year-old Time magazine review said the only admirable people were the Buchanans.
Right.
But the inconsistencies there. I am the only truly honest person whom I know, and in the beginning, my father reminded me that when I'm about to judge people, to remember that they have not had the same advantages I've had, or something worse to that effect. So he's sort of mollifying in advance what he's going to say. I think it adds to his, let's see, to his credibility with me. It adds to see that he is flawed. Nick, is flawed, or that he's a bit inconsistent. He has that
He's human.
scorn for what Gatsby seems to come from and represent. And he never gets into the criminal side of it, the alleged criminal side of it. And then the glow that Gatsby seems to have about him, and the smile and the attention that he pays, so that there was words like people like to say about some politicians, you get the feeling that this person is you're the only person in the room
Right.
when that person is looking at you.
Bill Clinton.
It's a certain skill. Well, I think it's a good starting point for our discussion today to address that Tom brought up, just kick it around a little bit. Are there other inconsistencies that are glaring?
I don't remember.
I think Nick is, he says he's about not judging people too quickly because his father reminded him of his advantages and stuff like that. But he is very judgmental about the people who come and go, and there seems to be pretty good reason for it. I mean, you look at the insipid conversations these people have, what they talk about, and the drunkenness that seems to pervade all these parties, and people who just show up uninvited, and nobody cares about Gatsby at all. And there's this incredible shallowness that he ascribes to just about every participant, either mildly or very sardonically. And Meyer Wolfsheim is a pretty good example, I think, of. For between the lines, you can tell Caraway does not care for Wolfsheim, especially when he can't even show up for the funeral, even though he claims to have been a friend. But I guess, that was a sort of an oblique reference, I thought, to the shady side of Gatsby's past, where he was, in whatever he was involved in, bootlegging, selling whiskey out of the grocery stores, and probably cocaine and whatever else was there. Cocaine came along, one of you was telling me, or somebody was telling me, because of the trying to get Civil War wounded off of morphine. That it came about as a sort of a previous.
I thought morphine was supposed to be a substitute for heroin. I don't think cocaine was.
Well, did they have, I don't know if they had, was heroin around in this country during the Civil War?
I think it was, but I don't know.
Well, cocaine was an accepted
Yes.
drug. People used
It
it
in Coca-Cola.
It was in Coke, yeah.
until it got outlawed. But anyway, whether he was involved in that or not, there was a reference. Remember that anonymous phone call that came in from, and Nick answers the phone, and somebody was talking about something that didn't make any sense, but it said, tell him that so-and-so has delivered the bonds or something like that.
Right.
So it was a reference to some nefarious ongoings about bond fraud that he was involved in. But Nick, in that instance, does not go on to tell us something like, so this just confirmed my suspicions about the dark side of Jay Gatz,
Right.
AKA Gatsby. I suspected all along that he was criminal, and now here was something. He doesn't say that. He just lets us see it. So it's what I would call a highly dramatized, that is a displayed idea instead of an idea that is told to us by an omniscient narrator. That's one of the things that I like about having a first-person narrator, that we can always, or should always, have some skepticism. And so when these occurrences are related to us through the eyes and ears of Nick Carraway, we can see we can see a definite attitude that he has. He uses all sorts of pejoratives to describe people in some of the most eloquent ways. He dismisses so many in a very eloquent way, in an elegant way. What about Jordan Baker and the narrator's relationship with her? I mean, what's she doing in there? Does she belong in there? What does she do? How does she advance the action? I think I could entertain an idea that she really doesn't belong in there. She doesn't do anything for the action.
Yeah,
So, tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah.
She serves as a, I think we gotta listed as like a personality that everybody else's personality bounces off, and we're able to see more clearly the other people and not her. So she isn't like a defined personality, but just a bust belief of everyone else's, in my opinion. Like when the whole exchange between her and Nick about driving and careless people. She says, "Oh, I don't care for careless people, only I can be careless. Everyone else should be very careful, and I'm gonna, back on that." That's very interesting. And especially that she has that short conversation with Nick. So, like, that she had it with Nick. Nick was the responsible one. I think I'll gonna stay near you. He says. But that whole exchange is to make Nick seem more reliable. It doesn't really give a very clear picture of her.
Well, it was a reflection. I mean, she's basically okay, except that she cheats at golf.
Yeah.
Well,
No, she lied about
Compulsive
car.
yeah.
Yeah, so she reflects a lot of the meretriciousness of the other major characters surrounding us.
Yeah, if you left her out, it would be a less interesting story because she is a counterpart to Nick, what Daisy is to Tom. And so it allows you to see how the relationships are based on less than honesty, and how with Nick, he doesn't, he eventually ends the relationship because of that.
Well, she blows him off, I think, in the end, and she says, "I'm going to marry somebody else."
Yeah, but he doesn't care.
He doesn't care, but he goes, after that, he says something about he did feel a kind of love for her or something, but he just pushes it aside. He doesn't have time for that kind of personal involvement. That's what I got out of it, which was not a very nice thing to say about Nick. He didn't have time to get to know him, but he is ambivalent towards her. The first description, she's sitting there, like a painting, with her chin lifted as though we're balancing something in this sort of affectation that she had. But they have mild romance, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Nick is maybe he was used to bring out that quality. Fitzgerald was used to bring out that quality in his narrator that made him more human.
This says Jordan exists mainly as a device to draw Nick into the plot.
Right.
I think she's communicating, like she tells Nick that Tom has a woman,
Right.
in a way that's sort of a shortcut.
Yeah, she does.
She doesn't love that.
Critical information that you wouldn't get otherwise. Yeah.
Well, she just sees herself as above everybody else because she's a famous athlete. She doesn't need to bother with the riffraff around her.
And also birds of a feather flock together.
Oh, yeah.
So.
She so she does serve a purpose. I'm throwing it out as a challenge. Who am I to say F. Scott Fitzgerald didn't do a very good job? I think it's a great novel, and I think that kind of inconsistency made Nick Carraway more more believable as a person with weaknesses or flaws or predilections or prejudices. And yet he's trying to tell us. I noticed in this reading, it got my attention again when Nick at different times describes for us things that were going on in Gatsby's past, like Gatsby's first encounter with Daisy before he shipped off to the war. And the descriptions are very subjective, as though they were coming from someone involved. And I thought, I was going to pull this off, because there were all sorts of metaphors or comparisons to describe what was going on between Gatsby and Daisy, or in a later point, with Gatsby and who is the rich fellow with the yacht?
Dan.
Yeah, that's the guy who died and left all of his money. He left $25,000 to Gatsby, but Gatsby couldn't get it because the other woman, the courtesan, had made off with all of it. So, but how is it that we get? I just thought it was a little bit inconsistent to go into the sort of very personal description of something that Carraway could never have seen or observed or been a part of. And yet, of course, the language is beautiful. The descriptions of either of admiration or of contempt are very good. And I wish I'm absent-minded teacher here. I forgot. I brought everything except my copy of Gatsby, where I had all my notes and everything, and all the dog-eared pages turned down. All right, so we move from, not that we have to conclude definitely or everybody agree about the reliability of the narrator. We can go into the story itself. And I had suggested last week that in the copy that Annabelle has on pages 60 to 64, the end of chapter 3, and in Anne's copy, it's on 97. When he, anybody got that? I wanted to read. May I borrow this? Grab it. I'm reading here. Jordan Baker instinctively avoided clever, shrewd men, and now I saw that this was because she felt safer on a plane where any divergence from a code would be thought impossible. She was incurably dishonest. And I skip on down, the next paragraph, it says, it made no difference to me. Dishonesty in a woman is a thing you never blame deep. How does that play with today's audience? So it was a really jaded thing to say. And I don't know exactly what he really meant by that trying to speak for all men, we would always overlook that some kind of dishonesty.
He's been burned several times.
Mm-hmm. But he's willing to overlook it, so that's only 3 chapters in. And I was wondering if it occurred to anybody how that pronouncement of his might have affected other parts of this novel when Nick deals with Jordan Baker, Daisy, even Myrtle, who saw it at the scene in New York where Tom broke her nose for continuing to say Daisy, Daisy, Daisy in a taunting way. He couldn't take the guilt, so he lashed out at the thing that was making him guilty.
But there weren't any women in this book that were, honorable, I mean, all the main female characters. I never have thought of Fitzgerald as a misogynist, but he definitely didn't like certain kinds of women, Maybe mothers get a break, but I don't know.
Well, Daisy's a mother, but not much of a one.
No, but I know, but the child, you know, his own mother made a conception for him, but I don't know.
So, well, we get the perspective of one character who's involved, more than peripherally involved, with the goings on. Even though he, despite his contempt for the kind of scene that Gatsby's mansion hosts, he still participates and mixes it up with people to some extent. Was there anything to shift abruptly again? I was talking with the head of the English department at the Lovett School when I was teaching there, and we were talking about this book, and he said, I never did figure out what those big eyes meant. The ophthalmologist or the optometrist's eyes. He said, what's that all about?
Yeah, a reference to T.S. Eliot and his eyes on the wasteland.
Mm-hmm.
That's why.
Eliot really liked this book.
And Eliot was a big influence on Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
So.
And his the eyes on the world, the eyes that are seeing, and it's all above the ash heap, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which in my reading around was it was a real place apparently where refuse and garbage and garbage from destroyed buildings was dumped, ashes and excavated dirt and other things. So it really was a place that existed, whatever that's worth. But the eyes are right there looking over. I was trying to think of that. Hope I'm not stretching too far here, but the eyes overlooking all the detritus of civilization as it appears there as dirt, refuse, garbage, probably bodies and
Yeah, and you kind of get that they are eyes of judgment too. I mean, they makes it come, So I mean, if you want to say that it's, our moral judgment or the eyes of God, looking out over all of this, but they're the judgmental ones. They're the aspects of morality, and that's kind of the classic understanding of what the eyes are for.
yeah, the
But he
eyes.
doesn't want to say that. He'd much rather just leave it,
Eyes are
ambiguous.
metaphorically we see sort of like eyewitness news. I see, therefore I comprehend. No, that ain't the way it works. But that's the way that we are often led to believe, well, I witnessed this, I witnessed that, I've seen it up close, so I therefore understand. But that's not the way true perception is. By the way, anybody agree with me that the verb perceive and the noun perception is almost never correctly used in parlance today? I mean, to perceive is to see truly something, an idea or a person or an act or a word for what it really is. It's not just to form an opinion. But I think that's the way the word is misused all the time. Perception is greater than reality is a cliche. But I would say imperception is at times greater than reality. We form an opinion we think we have perceived. Anyway, it's not apologetic. Curious. Throw that out. Pardon?
Is imperception a word? I think
I
so.
believe so.
Oh, okay. Good, where's that meeting with?
Well, by God, it is now. I don't know. It's a good question. It may not be. We coin all kinds of words, like athleticism. I think that's a witty remark by an athlete. We hear that all the time. So back to the eyes. In what way, just stepping aside from this particular novel for a second, vision and the eyes that see. What about the vision of those who are blinded? Does being blind enable one to perceive, to see in the sense of perceiving
Yes.
things that one had not so perceived before?
I have heard it used in that sense. Perception of a blind person, why not?
There's some
Perception
clarity.
is really with your mind, not with your eyes.
Yeah, they're instruments.
Yeah.
They're epistemological devices. The vision is one, sound is another, touch and taste and smell are others. What is the hymn or the lament at a funeral? The words are failing me. I once was blind, but now I see. What's your
Amazing
favorite?
Grace.
That's from
Amazing Grace.
Yeah, Amazing Grace. Thank you. Couldn't remember. Once was blind, but now I see. And it occurred, the first time it occurred to me to think about that was when I heard Ray Charles sing it. Who was blind almost all of his life, and he sang that. I once was blind, but now I see. I can
Well, it's
understand.
better than the other way around, I can tell you that.
Well,
Yeah.
speaking from personal experience, yeah.
The link between perception and judgment comes kind of in sequence, and prejudice is somewhere between those two. But you lead to a conclusion of reality based on perception. Discrimination is prejudice, like that way.
Ideas that one comes to associate with a certain action or a certain appearance or a certain attire.
If I see it on the internet, it must be true.
So you make a judgment about if you're interviewing people for whatever, whether it's for daycare or babysitters or employees. You're hiring people. I come from a sales background, and after teaching, I was in sales and leasing and commercial real estate. In that business, you probably don't want to hire somebody who is a very avid engineer. There's a prejudicial statement. But a lot of times, and I used to laugh about it with the engineers who were designing the buildings and stuff like that, real estate we were in. And they said, "Oh yeah, I'd never make it in sales because I don't like interacting with people. I want to solve problems, And I said a friend of mine told me when I was working with with an engineer who was heading up a big company, he had been kicked upstairs because the CEO left. And he wouldn't make a decision about a piece of land to buy, but he would spend $200,000 engineering the site and then say no. And again and again and again. That's when my friend, the engineer, who was also a salesman somewhere else, said, "Bill, engineers don't make decisions, they solve problems." And I never forgot that. It was kind of interesting. Couldn't pull the trigger on it. So if you interview someone or you've been an attorney all your career, and you worked with a lot of associates that you said couldn't write. And I believe what you say, and I still found it almost incredible that a fine law firm can't find people from all the highfalutin law schools in the country who can write. But another friend of mine said, it's true, because law schools don't teach you to write. They teach you other stuff, very important things, but they don't teach you to write. So did you interview prospective associates
Some,
and make decisions?
but you don't really know what you have until you have it. And these kids are incredibly bright, they just right off the chart, but they can't write an English sentence.
So you spent a lot of legal hours for which you were not paid to rewrite the briefs.
And then 1 year, the first years, I was sort of the grammar police. I mean, those kids would come out with sentences that were like 2 pages long, and I said, no judge is gonna sit here and try to figure this out. And he's either gonna be able to read it or he's not, short.
Yeah, sentences that don't parse and ideas. Well, it was my divergence here was just trying to illustrate how perception and prejudice go hand in hand quite often, and sometimes it's necessary to overcome a certain amount of. I mean, prejudice is a very strong word these days, or prejudicial judgment on things, like a discriminating person used to be someone who could see very clearly what things were, to see the difference between falsehood and truth, or to be discriminating in a positive way. Now, it almost always means ethnic or racial or religious discrimination, and not discrimination that has any value anymore.
Well, there's a positive and a negative discrimination. I think that's the difference.
Yeah. Do you think most people think of the positives and discriminatory attitudes?
No.
No, I think the way, as you said, the way it's being used now, it's pretty negative.
Yeah. So we find, is Nick a discriminating man?
Yes, actually, I think he is. He's somewhat tolerant, but he does make his judgments, and he does say, this I agree with, and this I don't agree with. So that's the discrimination. It doesn't have to be negative. It can be, I prefer this.
I found myself drawn sympathetically to almost all of his judgments.
Yeah.
Because the meretricious pursuit of pleasure, that was a word that came out of the 60s, wasn't it? A phrase, pursuit of pleasure instead of pursuit of happiness, came out of the heyday of the upper echelons during the Jazz Age, when there were still a lot of people suffering, like Wilson, George Wilson and his ilk. But the pursuits, they just seem so meaningless.
That was sort of class discrimination. Pull down the rod, take the man's wife, you drive off with him.
Yeah.
It shows that they had no respect for him. They didn't care what he thought. And she didn't care what he thought. What?
Right. Yeah, she was not a very sympathetic character, except to the extent to which she was just kind of another person thrust into a very, very difficult and almost untenable situation.
I think she thought maybe she would get some cases stuff. Maybe Tom would all of a sudden fall in love with her. These days, she saw the money.
That's an oft-told tale, isn't it?
Yeah.
The person in love with a married person who promises to leave the spouse and marry the paramour, and it never happens. And it just makes for a lot of hurt all the way around.
How does Tom make the initial contact with her?
He just goes right there in front of the husband, picks her up. They remember they're on that road trip and they
Yep.
stop and he picks her up and they go off to a party in New York.
To see
But
her
before that,
sister, ostensibly.
but I think Tom's point, he had been seeing her before the scene that we see.
Yeah.
So how did he meet her? I don't know. I can't remember. I guess just happenstance, filling up at the filling station or whatever they called it.
And he seems to buy and sell cars from George Wilson.
Mhm.
They seem to have deals going. So he clearly has an ongoing relationship with George Wilson. Now, where his wife drops into that is never clear, I think.
She's just roadkill.
No, what is she?
No pun intended.
Oh, yes, there was. Yes, there was.
Untaken.
No, I mean, she's collateral damage. I mean, Tom is a predator. Tom is he's if a woman is halfway really, he's more than willing, so,
But not of his own class,
but not of the what?
not of his own class.
Right, he's preying on,
That kind of
that's an interesting,
made me wonder,
yeah.
presumably she's not highly educated or she wouldn't be married to George Wilson,
Yeah.
probably, who presumably doesn't have a great deal of education. So I'm in my own mind, putting her on that level. Now, what is Tom? Yeah, how would Tom pick her out, other than just an easy pickup?
Simple as that.
I guess that's all it is.
It was easy to do. Sling some money around, take her to New York City and some gala events or whatever it is. It just is all so very enticing, I guess.
And this apartment they go to doesn't seem to be anybody's apartment, it's just where they all meet.
Oh, I think it's Tom.
Yeah, he paid for it,
Tom may be paying for it, but it's,
Yeah, and nobody lives there.
No.
It's just,
nobody lives there,
it's
yeah.
just,
yeah. Meet up place.
right.
It's just a meeting point.
Just a pied a terre
Yeah,
Yeah,
for convenience sake.
right. So her sister obligingly comes to cover her excuses,
yeah.
going to town to see my sister.
It occurred to me, well, did it occur to anybody looking at poor grammatical structure, poor diction that Fitzgerald used to dramatize the lack of education that you just alluded to? For instance, Myrtle says things like, I got to do this and I got to do that. Instead of I need to do it or I have to do it. It was something that the others don't say. It was more of a lower class argot or cant or something. And it occurred in other places too. I think that friend of Jordan Baker's had the woman, I can't remember her name, she had some of the same grammatical excesses.
And
Got my back up.
And Gatsby's father.
Mhm. Yes.
Makes you wonder about Daisy. Now, she has an elegant upper-class background, but obviously she's married at 18. She doesn't have any extensive education, which I guess is sort of typical of the women of that time. All she had to be was rich and beautiful, and she doesn't need to be intelligent.
Yeah, she didn't
There's
have,
still
she
some women who
didn't have to work. Like the vast majority of women, I guess from in my own upbringing, so I was on the tail end of the baby boomers, I guess. And I think as I look back at family members, there were very few of my aunts, and I had a few because my father's family was pretty big. What work they did was usually as volunteers, although with some exceptions, but usually it was not, or it was just to be productive. It wasn't so absolutely necessary to preserve the family. That changed pretty quickly during my life, where dual income became very much the usual. Are we getting a little bit too far afield here? I was thinking about the language that they use. I had another thought. Oh, I know the Meyer Wolfsheim, the way he speaks. And speaking of connections instead of connections.
It took me a while to figure that one out.
Yeah.
I had to say it out loud a couple of times.
I think those are sort of counterpoints to the language that Caraway uses. His language is educated, proper. You know, he doesn't, I guess he ends a sentence with a preposition every now and then, but other than that, it stands in stark contrast to, as I'm going to say, even to Daisy. Of course, the topics that Daisy hits on are not very deep.
No.
I mean, she's not pondering the evils of war or wondering about the state of morality. Like her conscientious husband, Tom, he's very worried about the state of morality. And that book the title, I think there was some critic who said Fitzgerald got the title. It was not an exact one, but it was very much like something that was written about the surge of non-white races into the world or into the Western world anyway. But there wasn't much of a point made there. It was just perhaps that critic was lending some sort of credibility to that outrageous book that Tom Buchanan references, as though to say, you know, there were some books like this around.
Oh,
So it's not
based on a real book.
Yeah, it's not a stretch to think that somebody might have picked that up.
Yeah.
And of course, miscegenation was against the law, and I don't know whether it was in every state, but it was in many. And it was only rescinded, I think, in Virginia, I think in the 50s, 60s, maybe?
70s, I think.
70s?
Yeah, much more recent.
US, they're loving.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. 70s.
Early 70s.
We got a couple lawyers here?
No.
No, one.
Recovering.
He's out of me. That's a great way to put it.
So that's the name of the case, though,
Yes.
the Loving
Yeah.
versus the state of Virginia or something like that.
Yes,
That is a fabulous movie, by the way.
By that
I
title,
forget the name of it.
yes.
Wonderful.
I thought the name of it was,
About the
I
loving-
haven't seen it. I thought the name of it was Loving.
Loving.
Yeah, it is, love it.
so that's a film. There has been a good bit written about Fitzgerald's use of water in his works. One really good story. I'm not a big fan of his short stories, by the way. Come full confession. I didn't like The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Others did, some didn't, so that's good. I liked Winter Dreams. Not much water in that one, but The Swimmers, it was a good story. And there's water, and there's a lot of water in this novel. Water is a metaphor for all kinds of things, like what?
Like separation.
Yeah,
Separation.
across the pond.
What goes on beneath the water? We don't know. I mean, you can't see. I mean, you can, but we don't. It's just out there. You don't know what's going on down there, the life forms or the dead bodies in concrete that are down there.
Yeah,
It's interesting that we think of water as separation. And yet, if you go back in the history of this county and the bay in general, water was the connecting factor,
Yeah.
not separating. When I was looking back at some of my genealogy, there's a number of marriages that took place between people who grew up across the water from each other. Oh, access.
But look at the bay and how there's the west and the east and how
Yeah.
until they built the bridge.
Since 1952 only.
Yeah.
Because I can remember my relatives talking about that, when that darn bridge opens, everything's gonna change around here. They were right.
Yeah.
But I remember them saying that before that bridge opened.
Yeah, but before then, you had to take a ferry across.
That's right.
And
That was the connecting thing.
yeah, but it's also a separating thing. That people are
Yeah.
much more connected now with the bridge than they were when they had to take a ferry.
It's easier.
It's a whole lot easier, yes.
It's quicker, certainly.
Yeah, and
But-
so, yes, you could connect, but it's an increase in difficulty of connection.
And
Yeah.
it's
Well, but they,
departures was-
they took that time factor, that was taken for granted.
Right.
At that time. From here, you walk down to Eastern Point and get the ferry, and in the morning, you're in Baltimore.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that was considered fast.
Yes, it was, yeah. But when you talk about, for example, England and the United States, the other side of the pond. They talk about, it can be a connection if they're close, but anything beyond that, it's a barrier.
Well,
Unless you have a boat.
Yeah, it's neither all one way or all the other.
Right.
It's both at the same time. But the England, of course, the British Empire grew out of its being unassailable by armies because you had to cross the channel. I mean, it was only 20 miles, but still, that was huge.
Yeah.
1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. And the United States, you got these huge bodies of water on either side. And that was, what initially kept Germany from just marching in as was done in Poland and Czechoslovakia, Holland, and everywhere else where he went. And he held off on England. It was more challenging to have to do that. They had to do it by air, by bombing, and then softening things up so they could invade. So it's both a connector and a separator. In Gatsby, it's a pretty big body of water. I mean, it's not huge, but it's you don't swim across to Daisy's house. It's bigger than that. And so it emphasizes metaphorically for me the separation between Daisy and Gatsby, and that there was it emphasizes that there is a big chasm there, both emotional and in time, their separation over the 5-year period.
If the green light became a white.
Yeah, it's very alluring. And it wasn't a white light, it was a green light. It was much more, the color's more appealing to me. See it on here, it's sort of it's a very pretty color.
But he's in West Egg, she's in East Egg. Somehow West Egg is inferior,
Mhm.
Why is Gatsby there?
Oh,
That's
and
how I felt.
That occurred to me.
Or why hadn't he moved?
I'm sorry, what I,
Yeah, but that was because he felt inferior or he had to be inferior to Daisy in some way. Like she lives over on the right side of the track.
well, the right side of the tracks would never have allowed somebody like Gatsby to own the property. Have you lost your mind? I don't have an answer. I don't know. That's probably not a very good answer. So there's
That's probably true.
not much other explanation for it.
How does that reflect Fitzgerald's Connecticut? Is the same dynamic there, Greenwich versus up the coast?
I don't know. I don't know enough about his biography. What do you think? Maybe somebody's read a lot more about his life in Greenwich. Okay, so water can also be a cleansing device, right? Like baptism, the symbolic cleansing, purification. If it's water that's near the ash heap, it's probably not drinkable, not potable. So it can be a repository of filth, germs. I do not have a point to make here about the water. I just throw it out because a lot has been said about it, and Fitzgerald has a lot of his stories deal with water here. He's used, I think, as a separation. Incidentally, indulge me a second. I grew up on the south side of the Rappahannock River. The north side is the Northern Neck, Potomac on the north side of that. And some years ago, well into my adulthood, my wife and I drove down to spend some time with a friend who had a cabin down there. And I got to talk to one of the locals, and I said, why hasn't this area ever been developed? This is, in the 70s, I guess, when development was starting to happen a lot. And he was a good bit older than I. He said, well, it was the waterman's lobby that precluded development of extensive highways and no railroad. Railroads didn't come down there because the transportation would have wrecked the livelihoods of thousands of watermen who depended on the Chesapeake Bay as a mode of transportation so they could get seafood and produce and everything, and tobacco up to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. So the physical separation that water produces can have a big effect as well. And perhaps, well, it's not clear in this novel. Did you see, isn't there a map in one of these that shows the actual geography and it's called, East Egg and West Egg is actually, it's not called that, it's called what? Is this the Hamptons?
Big Harbor.
I can't remember, but it's on the way in Sagaponack, which is a writer's colony for a long time, farther out. And Manhasset is there in the East Egg section, I think. I can't remember. Anyway, the separation by water and the joining by water, just kind of interesting rhetorical devices that can be used at times, as well as the cleansing and the Pontius Pilate washing his hands of the trial of Jesus Christ and other such, that Lady Macbeth trying to wash away the blood stains, she's going through her insanity. Does this novel, well, how are we doing on time?
Sure.
25 minutes.
Does the novel speak to what one critic in dealing with Macbeth's soliloquy called existential despair, in which, you remember Macbeth says, tomorrow creeps in his petty face, and all of our yesterdays are but lighted fools away to dusty death, out, brief candle, light of the morning shadow. So that he, Macbeth, is thinking, everything has really come to nothing for him. And for Lady Macbeth, who goaded him on to seize the throne and murder Duncan, and so on. Does this novel touch on that? What does it have in common with the lost generation that Gertrude Stein called this cadre of writers? Hemingway, Dost Passes, Fitzgerald.
There's clearly an existential element there between present, past, reflection on, the initial relationship with the past, and Gatsby saying, or he's kind of reliving the past. The only element that's missing is the future, past, present, future. So there's clearly an existential thing.
How does that relate then to when he tells, when Nick says, you can't repeat the past? He says, of course you can.
Yeah.
Of course you can repeat the past.
The only person who has enough depth to make it existential is Nick. Yeah, the Buchanans don't have the depth. Jordan doesn't have the depth. So for them, even Gatsby doesn't have the philosophical depth to make it existential. He's just kind of caught up in it, And he doesn't wring his hands, he's just killed, So, no, the only existential issue at all is Vic.
He's the only one in the novel that seems to contemplate
Right.
anything. The rest of them just live by rote, as I like to say, they just live by ritual and rote, they just get carried off with what they're going to do next. Where's the next party or the next event going to be? Racing around in meaninglessness from one to the other. So I think Paul's got a good point about Nick being the only one who would be contemplating. Well, so do you think we can sort of leave that one for next week as a concluding motif or device to chat about? Are there other characters that we have overlooked that we haven't spent enough time with? Because they're more about Jordan Baker.
Well, Mr. Gatz is the most admirable person in the book.
Probably.
I thought that was really well rendered.
Yeah,
Authentic.
Yes.
yeah.
The lies that Gatsby tells about himself, he fabricates a lot of stuff. He doesn't mention, he doesn't describe where he got his wealth, except to say, to tell Nick he came from a very wealthy family in the Midwest. And Nick said, where? And he said, San Francisco.
Yeah, I like that.
And one critic I was reading wondered, there was some question about whether it was intentional or if it could have been Fitzgerald's ignorance. I don't think it could possibly have been Fitzgerald's ignorance.
No,
He was from the Midwest after all. He was in San Francisco, wasn't.
But it's very typical of New York, in New York, anything beyond.
You remember the cover of the New Yorker magazine, and it would have that, there's New York City as a big thing and everything else, squeezed into about 2 inches.
West of the Hudson.
Well, the circumscription of these characters' lives, what do you say about that? Are these characters, is there a circumscription are they circumscribed in such a way that they are trapped? Are they trapped in their destiny? Are they trapped in the past? When Gatsby uttered that one, I'm a Faulkner dude, and so it made me think about Faulkner's obsession with people being trapped in their past and unable to escape tradition, mores, habits, customs, and so forth, that continue to victimize them. And we're speaking about the Deep South after the war and on into the 20th century. But it has much more universal application than just that. There's an entrapment anywhere. I mean, we can go to pick any city, you can find closed societies anywhere, King. I mean, who belongs to this country club? And we don't talk to them because they belong to that. I'm exaggerating a lot of things, I think. But you do find that. I mean, birds of a feather flock together, it's cliche. We like to associate with those people who seem to reflect the values and the mores and the things that we like and enjoy, and that's where we cling. And so that's where preference comes from, and then prejudice is next, right? I love Faulkner, and I hate anybody who doesn't like him. We do, but these people, who was it last week who mentioned Dreiser? About Dreiser's characters in An American Tragedy. That are they, as one critic wrote many years ago, they're something like this, they're buffeted about by forces of which they have only a vague awareness, like climate, the Dust Bowl of the 30s, war, the world economy, the national economy, stuff that you can't get through. Tennessee Williams did a pretty good job of that too in the Glass Menagerie. Tom was sort of trapped there. They were impoverished and living hand to mouth, and they couldn't escape it. It was kind of a tough situation.
It's not so much the past or history, it's character. It's character, it's destiny. Because some of us, if you take two people from the same background, from the same time period, etc., and one will survive quite well and one will not. It's the individual character that is the determining factor. It's the fact that I can't really. It's Tom's and Daisy's and Jordan's lack of character that is not just their socioeconomic status. I mean, yes, it plays into it, but they could have been. I mean, there are rich people who've done great things. They don't have to be empty, shallow.
We don't get the idea that Buchanan was a great philanthropist.
No.
Like so many other extremely wealthy, but Albany, Carnegie Mellon, who did wonderful things with a lot of the wealth.
And that's character. Same situation, but different character.
And do you think that kind of character, what does guilt have to do with that kind of generosity?
I don't think that's that much of a driving force.
I agree.
No.
I don't think so. I mean, there's a desire to help others. This
Yeah. It's a
sincere.
more positive.
You don't give that sophistical argument about everything is selfish. I do a generous thing because it makes me feel good, therefore I'm selfish.
No.
That's a silly argument.
That's a humanity.
So are these people, why is it that they are that the Buchanans are so crass and so willingly unaware of anything aside from themselves? I mean, I should have phrased that here. What statement is this novel, is Fitzgerald making about these kinds of people? Are they to be pitied? Are they beyond help? Are they deserving only of our immitigable contempt and scorn? Is there any hope for them?
No.
Is there balm in Gilead?
There's a hope for them because of who they are.
And they like who they are.
Yeah, that's good.
They don't even question who they are.
Yeah, they're very,
They want everyone else to be who they are. Yeah,
very smug.
very smart. They're not interested in change
Yeah.
of who they are. No.
So does he just rule people?
Someone last week asked, why did they leave Chicago?
Yeah, I did. I'm trying to.
There is a passage
Oh, okay.
that explained it. I stumbled on it as I was rereading. Well, it was just something, Tom got into trouble with some other woman.
Right.
And I think there's an allusion to that. It doesn't make a big point of it, or somebody says, Daisy said, that's why we had to leave Chicago, or something like
Well,
that.
she says at one point, well, we go back to Chicago. And he said, you can't.
Oh, okay, very
I was
good.
looking for that.
Yeah, that was part of it.
But ultimately they do.
Mhm. And why did they go to, where were they? They moved to West Egg. Which egg are they?
There he is.
They're East Egg.
Gatsby Glass. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, it would have to be. Why did they come from Europe? They'd been in Rome or Paris or somewhere, hadn't they? Been in Europe, and they moved to East Egg. But there wasn't much explanation for it.
I don't know. I don't remember them saying much that in Europe. Myrtle and her sister had been to Monaco, remember, and lost all their money.
Lost all their money.
In the casino, so they didn't like Europe very much. But at one point they had talked about how the sister was Catherine, I think, was saying to Nick that, that they think, you know, they want to get married, they hate who they're married to, they want to get divorced, and then move out west, and he says, well, try being more discreet to Europe. You know, and she goes off on Europe and how they got robbed at the casinos, you know, so.
I thought that was
But
pretty
it was her.
pathetic
I don't
too.
think, I don't think Casey and Tom spent much time.
Well, maybe I'm mistaken about that.
Yeah. I don't remember them spending a lot of time.
The, what Nick says about them toward the close, though, and I can't quote it exactly, but in the very beginning of the novel, he contemptuously says something about a particular location, which is where people like the Buchanans went to play polo and be rich together,
Yes.
as though that was an occupation. Being rich together, I thought it was a beautiful statement. But at the end of the novel, he says something about whether they move around. Do you recall? I can't quote it. May I?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, yes.
I don't know whether I can find it, but it's about the way that they just move around. They don't have any roots.
And what are they doing in East Egg anyway? What, does Tom have any kind of a job or just
No.
income from?
He's a trust company, baby.
Yeah.
I mean, his family was extraordinarily wealthy. Is all that I got out of it.
That's, yes, I didn't see any other means of obvious income, so I guess it's just all family money.
I found this passage. Nick is talking with Tom. Tom is saying he ran over Myrtle like he'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. Then there's nothing there to say except one unutterable fact that it wasn't true. Of course, Tom doesn't know Daisy was driving. And if you think I didn't have my share of suffering, look here. When I went to give up that flat and saw that damn box of dog biscuits, I sat down and cried like a baby. There is a side of Tom that comes out when he's trying to give some comfort to poor old George. Remember, he lifts him up and he carries him in and he tells people, you've got to have somebody to stay here with him. It was an aberration from his usual crass, uncaring self. Made him a little bit more believable for me. I hated to just dismiss him as entirely two-dimensional.
Oh, but
It's
he's
easy
also
to
being
do.
manipulative because he's going to tell, you know, yeah.
Yeah, very manipulative. Anyway, this goes on. It says, I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw that what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made as they just wander about hitting at this and that and making a mess and writing a check for it, but not bothering about the effect that it might have had on other people, the very ill effects it might have had on other people. He goes on, really. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I felt suddenly as though I were talking to a child. Then he went into the jewelry store to buy a pearl necklace or perhaps a pair of cuff buttons. Pretty good dramatization of Tom's crassness at the same time that I was trying to suggest that there was some possible inkling, some hope of redemption in Tom, because he cared about George. He cared enough about George to try to make him comfortable and try to give him get other people to make sure that they were around and taking care of him. Not that was so difficult to do. It didn't tax him a lot, but I'd expect him just to walk off. Expect him just to say, oh, well.
It's really the only time we see that side of Tom. I kept wondering what happened to the poor dog.
Maybe that's a good point, that the fact that the dog just got completely ignored shows that, that it wasn't, of course, it was Myrtle's dog.
Yeah.
She's
Yeah.
dead.
She's dead, so who's gonna take it, Catherine? The
dog proved a device, though, because remember when George talks about the leash that he had found wrapped up in tissue paper, it was a telltale story to him that
it's a
his
fancy.
wife had some other a life that he didn't know about or something. It hinted at that. So there was a usefulness in there. At first, I thought it was kind of pointless. Although it gave the author a chance to make another judgment, another tacit judgment on Tom Buchanan, because Tom corrected the guy on whether it was male or female. And of course, he called it a bitch. He wasn't going to. I think among dog breeders, that word is not a pejorative. I think it's common. People don't think of it as a swear word or a denigration. But he made that point, and then what did he say? Here's $10. Go and buy another 10 and sell them. You trash. You get it. So it didn't matter. $10 was a whole lot of money in those days, wasn't it? Buy a lot. Well, somebody ran there was a footnote somewhere that said, I think it was about Fitzgerald making money when he was paid $1,000 a week, and then it went up to $1,250 a week by MGM or some big movie house. You think about that in the 20s. I think the comment was that was more like being paid, about $12,000 or $15,000 a week, which in today's world would be a pretty considerable sum.
Yeah, he made more money there than for anything else.
You have like $500,000 a year or something.
650,000.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't last very long,
Yeah. And he got,
too much drinking.
too much of that. Pardon me?
Both Faulkner and Fitzgerald hated the prostitution factor being in Hollywood.
Yeah. A lot of funny stories about Faulkner's experiences writing script and stuff. Save that for another time. Pretty funny. For next week, as we wind down, I think it would be interesting, see if you agree, to find a few passages in here that you think are informative, really lyrical, really beautifully written, so we could take a look at the language itself. And I think there's plenty in there, both on the sardonic side by Nick, and then on the with Fitzgerald's use through Nick, various metaphors and similes as he compares things and the descriptions that he has of certain things. I think it's worth, because as you know, the cliche about this novel is it's very lyrical. I can't think of another word, actually, but it is beautifully written. There are parts of it that are very poetic. And I didn't find any of that. Some of it in Winter Dreams, I think, but I didn't find any of it much in the Diamond story.
Yeah,
I
thought
found
that
a
was
lot of it here.
I thought that was his attempt to write Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but without any of the literary ability to do it.
Yeah, it wasn't very fetching. Yeah, Heart of Darkness is a good one. I mean, that's a tough one for me.
Yeah.
And it's easy enough to read in one sense, but it has such depth and ramifications and eternal unanswered questions. It really resonates. He used that narration also, that Marlowe the narrator, and Lord Jim.
Yeah.
Marlowe tells the story, and then we get into the story, and it's not Marlowe so much as it is Jim and Dane Morris and all the other characters that figure in that novel. But it's a good device, and the suspension. Sometimes, do you remember the Albert Finney, Tom Jones film back in the mid-60s, I think? And I remember at the time I was taking, I told myself I was studying 18th century English novels. And when that came out, remember there are several times in there where the character, Tom, turns to us, the audience.
Right.
You know, like, because it's sort of one, like some other woman hitting on him, and he looks at us and says, what am I supposed to do? But the suspension of the illusion was what I was getting at with that. Sometimes that can be a very, very effective device. And trying to think of the other film. No, it doesn't matter. Who wrote The French Lieutenant's Woman? And the Megas, John Fowles, or Fowles, F-O-W-L-E-S. In that book, which I struggled with, the author, the narrator becomes the author who addresses us, I think I've got this right, addresses the audience and says, so dear reader, what am I supposed to do now with this? I found it a little bit off-putting. I wasn't sure where we're all going into the nature of what it is to write a novel or something. I wanted to read a story. It wasn't there. Well, thanks very much to everyone.
Pretty good.
We had a good exchange today. I really enjoyed it. Look forward to next week.
One of the things that might be interesting is to talk about it.